Shavua Tov. We're up to Daf Mem Dalid Amud Beis on the bottom of the Amud, and we have a statement here of Rabbi Chia Brei de Rav Avia in the name of Rav Ashi. What's going on over here is that the Rabbanon of Rabbi Akiva derive the principle of Tam Ki'ikar from Mishras in Nazir. And from Tam Ki'ikar in Nazir, we have a derivation to apply Tam Ki'ikar to all Isurei Torah. We even called it a Kal V'chomer, that if it applies to Nazir, which has many kulos, how much more so should apply to other Isurim. Now, the same pasuk Mishras is derived by Rabbi Akiva, derives the principle of Hetem Mitztaref L'Isa. So the last question that we raised, which is the Gemara here on the daf, bottom of Daf Mem Daled Amud Beis, is why can't Rabbi Akiva do the same exact thing that the Rabbanan did? Meaning, if according to Rabbi Akiva we derive from Mishras Hetem Mitztaref L'Isa, why not extrapolate from Nazir to Kol Isurei Torah? Just like the Rabbanan used Mishras as the Binyanav to teach us Tam Ki'ikar and Kol Torah Kula, Rabbi Akiva doesn't need Mishras to teach you Tam Ki'ikar. That he derives from Geulei Akum. But the Rabbanan couldn't derive it from Geulei Akum, if you recall, because Chidushu. Rabbi Akiva understood that it was not a Chidush. The Rabbanan thought it was a Chidush because even if the Kli was a Ben Yomo, it still has a Miktsas Pgam. But Rabbi Akiva doesn't consider that Miktsas Pgam. So the bottom line is, Rabbi Akiva has a source for Tam Ki'ikar in Gulei Nachrim, and it's not a Chidush. He's going to extrapolate and compare all Isurei Torah and derive that from Geulei Akum. But in the case of the Rabbanan can derive Tam Ki'ikar not from Geulei Akum, which is a Chidush, but rather from Mishras in Nazir, and from Mishras in Nazir to Kol Isurei Torah. Now the Gemara wants to know, well, if Rabbi Akiva derives Heter Mitztaref L'Isur from Mishras, then what is going to be the blockage? Why is it that Rabbi Akiva, the way Rabbi Yochanan presents it, limits the principle of Hetem Mitztaref L'Isur only to Nazir? Why not use Nazir as the springboard and derive from Nazir Kol Isurei Torah? Just like the Rabbanan derive Kol Isurei Torah and Tam Ki'ikar from Mishras, from Nazir, why does Rabbi Akiva do the same? So the Gemara now on the top of Daf Mem Hey Amud Aleph says the following: Mishum Dahavin Nazir v'chatos Shnei Ksuva Bam Kechad. And we have a principle of Shnei Ksuva Bam Kechad Ein Malamd. Now the Gemara introduces at this juncture a new source, an alternative source for the principle of Hetem Mitztaref L'Isur, and that is chatos. What's going to happen is that a chatos has certain chumras that don't apply to other kodshim. Let's say, for example, if we were to compare a chatos to a shlomim could be eaten for 2 days and 1 night. Shlomim could be eaten not only by Zichrei Kahuna, but by the Bailim, Yisraelim, so that a Zar could eat the basar of Shlomim. Furthermore, the basar of Shlomim could be eaten anywhere in Yerushalayim. It's not limited to the Azara. And if we shift our emphasis onto chatos could only be eaten by Zichrei Kahuna, only eaten for 1 day and 1 night, and only within Yerushalayim. So what happens if the chatos comes in contact with a shlomim? And the Gemara is going to derive from the parsha of chatos through a yalfusa that the shlomim, by coming in contact with the chatos, is going to take upon itself all the chumras that apply to chatos. And then after we go through this Yalfusa, we'll see that Heter Mitztaref L'Iser applies not only to Nazir, derived from Mishras, according to Rabbi Akiva, but also to Chatos. And if the Torah teaches us the principle of Heter Mitztaref L'Iser not once, but twice, then we activate that rule that Shnei Ksuv Abam Kechen Ein Malamdim. Meaning, if the Torah would have thought that there's a universal principle of Heter Mitztaref L'Iser, it wouldn't have to repeat itself. We could have derived it from Nazir. We didn't need a special parish of Chatos. But the Torah apparently felt that by introducing Heter Mitztaref L'Iser in the case of Chatos, it teaches us that Heter Mitztaref L'Iser only applies to Nazir. We don't derive anything from Nazir. And even Chatos we derive from its own local drasha, its own Yalfusa. Nazir, what's the source for Heter Mitztaref L'Iser? Nazir, Hadi Amor. And that we've already discussed at great length. The Torah says Mishras, and we derive, according to Rabbi Akiva, Heter Mitztaref L'Iser. Chatos Mahi, what is the source from which we derive the principle of Heter Mitztaref L'Iser as it applies to Chatos? The Sanya, we learned in a Brisa, and now the Brisa is interpreting the Parsha of Chatos in Vayikra Perek Vav, and there the Torah says, Kol asher yiga b'bsara yikdash. With regard to a Chatos, anything that comes in contact with the basar of the Chatos becomes kadosh. What does it mean becomes kadosh? It now takes on the characteristics and the dinim that apply to Chatos. So therefore, let's say you have basar shlomim, and it comes in contact with Chatos, or for that matter, even basar chulin that comes in contact with Chatos. Yochal afilu lo bla'a. Maybe it means that if a Chatos comes in contact with another Chatich of basar, shlomim or chulin, the various possibilities that we mentioned. So I might think she basar shlomim sheyiga bebasar chatos yikdash yochal afilu lo bla, even if the chaticha that touches the chatos has no blia, tamalo bibsara. This teaches us the extra word bibsara, that piece of meat that came in contact with the chatos is not going to be sanctified with the surim that apply to a chatos unless it's bibsara, which means ad she yivla kamoha, ad she bola bibasar, which means that it had some sort of belia from the chatos, and the Torah says yikdash. Yikdash means lios kamoha, that all the dinim and the strict isurim that apply to a chatos now apply to that basar that has a blia of the chatos. And then the Brisa continues and says, She'im Yikdash. What does Yikdash mean? Lios Kamoha. So again, in the case of Chulin or Kachub Kalim, in the case of Shlomim, when there was an Egia B'Basar Chatos, which is Kachim Kachim, it now takes on the dinim of a Basar Chatos. She'im Psulahi, if the Chatos itself, for example, was Pigul or any other Psul Tipasel, then let's say in the case of a Korban Shlomim, it becomes Pasul. V'im Ksherahi, Te'achel Kechomer Sheba. Now the Shlomim takes on, as we said before, all the Chumras of Basar Chatos. It's got to be eaten in the Toch HaZorah, Zichrei Kuna, only for Yom HaLaila. Now, the basar that was bolea now has two minim to it. It has the shlomim, which is considered relatively kal, and it has the chamur, which is the chatos. And now the principle is kulo holech achar chamur. So it means that if he eats that which is kal, like for example, let's say he eats it tomorrow, then the basar, now that's mutter, becomes mitzdarev with the basar of the chatos. And now, if let's say, for example, he's got all told a kezayis' worth, then he violates the Isser of eating basar kodesh chutz zmano. So again, even though as far as the shlomim element in this mixture, he has every right in the world to eat it tomorrow, because he can eat shlomim for 2 days. But nevertheless, we're going to need nidon kechomer sheba, and we're going to take the chatzi zayis of shlomim. We're going to integrate it with the chatzi zayis of chatos in such a way that now if he eats the basar, a kezayis' worth of this mixture, he has violated the Isser of a kezayis chutz lizmanim. I'll just read to you the language here. He says, "Him yochal mimenu kidin hakal kigon sheyochal mimenu lemachras is yitztaref abosar amuter im hachatos l'shir kezayis ve'echoshev sha'ochal kezayis isur." In other words, now the chatos, it's already chutz lizmano. It becomes a kezayis of isur, but he's not eating a kezayis of the chatos. But now the heter is mitztaref l'isur with the chatos, and now says Rabbi Akiva, we have shnei ksuba bam kecharim malam. For Rabbanon, the Rabbanon derived from Mishras that tam ki ikar, nami nehevi nazir v'chatos shnei ksuba bam kechad v'yein malamdu. Why don't we assume that not only is nazir the paradigm case of tam ki ikar, but now we have chatos, which is again a paradigm case of tam ki ikar. So we have 2 sources in the Torah for tam ki ikar. And if that be the case, we're going to apply the principle of shnei ksuba bam kecharein malamtin, which is going to block, from the Chachamim's perspective, the ability of taking tam ki ikar from Mishras and Nazir and extending it to the entire matrix or constellation of all Isurim. So the Gemara says, Amri mitzvah tzrichi. We can answer the question as far as the Rabbanan is concerned and say, this is not a case of shnei ksuba bam ke'echad, but rather we need both of them. And the Torah felt compelled to teach us the same principle of tam kikar twice, once in the case of Nazir and another in the case of Chatos. And if that be the case, then it's not shnei ksuba bam ke'echad, and we don't apply ein malamd. For Rabbi Akiva, what about Rabbi Akiva? He holds that shnei ksuba bam ke'echad ein malamd applies here as far as heter mitztaref le'isur is concerned. The answer is we don't derive anything from Nazir l'kol ha'Torah kula, and the reason for that is tzrichi. We need chatos. Oh, so the Gemara says the following: my tzrichi. You just told me that you need chatos. So the Gemara explains, Bishlemi kasav rachmana b'chatos. If the Torah had told me the chiddush of chatos, that heter is mitztaref le'isur, lo gomar nazir minei. Although it's true that you cannot derive nazir from chatos, that's based on a principle chula mikadshim lo gamrino. We don't derive any conclusions from Kodshim to Chulin. In Kodshim, there's a special chumrah that the chumras hakdusha of a korban in Kodshim has special strictures and special strict dinim, and therefore the Torah was machadesh heter mitztaref le'isur in the case of chatos. So now I understand very well that the Torah certainly had to teach me chatos and couldn't rely on nazir. So if we only had heter mitztaref le'isur nazir, we would not. If we only had heter mitztaref le'isur and chatos, we would not be able to derive nazir. But now the Gemara is going to analyze what about the other way around. Had the Torah told me heter mitztaref le'isur and nazir, couldn't I have derived chatos? El lichov rachmana nazir v'teisei chatos v'tigna minei. And here you're not going to be able to say that we can't derive chulin from kodshim, because now we're deriving kodshim from chulin. It's the opposite direction. There's no reason why we can't derive all isurim Shabbat Torah from nazir. And then in that case, we could certainly derive chatos. So why did the Torah have to say chatos? And the answer is the Torah wanted to establish that there was no other justification for telling me the halacha of heter mitzaref l'isa in the case of chatos, other than the fact that shnei ksuvim, that the Torah is putting up a barrier and a limit. Don't derive heter mitzaref l'isa from nazir to other isurim. And now I'm going to plug it up and barrier it up and barricade it up with chatos for Rabbanon. But now we have to face that logical argument and defend the Rabbanon, because if the argument that we use to present Rabbi Akiva Shita is convincing, then what about the Rabbanon? Why don't the Rabbanon say that we cannot derive Tam Ki'ika from Nazir to Shari Surim because it's Shnei Ksuvim? The Torah didn't have to tell me in Chatos that we apply the principle of Tam Ki'ika. So the Gemara says, Amri L'cha Mitzvah Tzricha. We would not be able to derive Tam Ki'ikar and Chatos from Tam Ki'ikar in Nazir. And why is that so? With regard to Chatos, we need the Pasuk Lehetem Mitztaref Le'isa. We would derive, says the Gemara, this is a fascinating Gemara, that even the Rabbanan who denied the principle of Hetem Mitztaref Le'isa, but they agree in the case of Chatos, that the Torah went out of its way to teach me Hetem Mitztaref Le'isa. And that could not be a source for Kol HaTorah Kula because of the principle of Chula Mikodshim Lo Gomar. We cannot derive any conclusions with regard to Chulin from Kodshim. Mishras, now we get to Mishras in Nazir. That's coming to teach me Tam Ki'ikar. And we only have one source for Tam Ki'ikar. It's Litin Tam Ki'ikar, Mikana Tadon L'chol HaTorah Kula, that Tam is Ki'ikar. For Rabbi Akiva, what's Rabbi Akiva going to say? After all, Mishras, in the case of Tam Ki'ikar, this we don't need. Tam Ki'ikar is going to be derived, according to Rabbi Akiva, from Gi'ulei Nachrim, and from Gi'ulei Nachrim we extrapolate to Kol Torah Kula. Now Mishras is free. Once Mishras is free, we're going to derive from Mishras Hetem Mitztaref Le'isa. And therefore, we now have Mishras and Yikdash in the parish of Chatos, both of which are teaching Hetem Mitztaref Le'isa. Shnei Ksuva Bom Kecha, Travaila Hetem Mitztaref Le'isa, V'havele Shnei Ksuva Bom Kecha, V'kol Shnei Ksuva Bom Kecha Ein Molamdim. Now Rabbi Akiva has an attack from Rav Ashi. Rav Ashi is going to object. How does Rabbi Akiva justifiably derive the principle of Hetem Mitztaref Le'isa from Mishras? Only Rav Ashi l'Rav Kahana Elahod Sanya. In the parish of Nazir, it says Mikol Asher Ye'osa Mi Gefen Ayayim Mi Chartzana V'Adzag Lo Ye'ochel Limeid Al Isuri Nazir. Notice the Torah specifies here both Chartzanim and Zogim, Chartzanim and Zog. Shemitztarfim Zem Zeh. You can set up a kizayis, a shear of kizayis, to mechayev the Nazir for eating both Chartzanim and Zog. Shemitztarfim Zem Zeh. Now, if that be the case, asks Rav Ashi, Hashta, l'Rabbi Akiva, Iser v'heter mitztarfim, Iser v'Iser miboy. According to Rabbi Akiva, in the case of Mishras, he dips his bread into the yayin. The bread itself is heter, and yet Rabbi Akiva says it's mitztaref. It sets up the shear of kizayis. So if that's what we derive from Mishras, then how much more so Isa v'Isa, when the Torah prohibits both Chartzanim and Zogim, for sure that mitzvah. If you have a half a zayis worth of Chartzon and half a zayis worth of Zag, for sure there would be mitzvah. Later, Rav Kahana responds to Rav Ashi. He says that which Rabbi Akiva says, that Isa v'Heter are mitztarfim zem zeh, in the case of Mishras, that's only b'vas achas. When it's Iser, Iser, that's Bazecher Zeh. We have two different halachas over here. Halacha number one is when we eat pas with yayin, the nozir's chayim. Half is ice of this, half is ice of that. That's because he ate it b'vasachas. But in the case of two different isurim, isur v'isur, like chartzanim and zag, there he ate it b'zecher zeh. And now Rabbi Akiva is going to derive from that pasuk that you chayev, even though you didn't eat a half as ice of each one of the separate isurim, but they're both asur and they're both. In both cases, the Nazir is enjoined from these achilas, and therefore they are mitzvah. So let's just see if we can summarize what we have over here. Everybody agrees, both Rabbi Akiva and Rabbanan, that tam ki ikar, and that applies in kol isurim shebator. According to Rabbi Akiva, the source for that is gilei nachrim. The Rabbanan don't have gilei nachrim because that's a chidush, and therefore the Rabbanan are going to use mishras to derive tam ki ikar, and then apply that principle in kol isurei Torah. Whereas Rabbi Akiva is going to derive that from Gilei Nachrim. Now that Rabbi Akiva has the source from tam ki ikar from Gilei Nachrim, he now has mishras is free to teach him heter mitzaref leisur. However, since chatos also teaches heter mitzaref leisur, and we certainly could have derived chatos from Nazir, then the Torah is now, as we said before, setting up a barrier. And Shnei Ksuvim Abon Kechnei Malamdim. Hence, we will only find Heter Mitzaref Leisur in these two cases, according to Rabbi Akiva. Number one, in the case of Nazir, when he puts together a pas with Yayin, each one is mashlim the other, and he has now a Shir Kizayis. And the case of Chatos, when he has this blia of the Basar Shlomim being Boleh the Basar Chatos. The Rabbanan again now seem to reject Rabbi Eliezer, who says that if you recall back on Daf Mem Gimel, that in a Taruvas Chometz, we say that you don't get Malchus, according to the Rabbanan of Rabbi Eliezer, if you eat it on Pesach, even though it has both Chometz and other ingredients of Heter. And the answer is that the Rabbanan of Rabbi Eliezer, even though, again, in the case of Kutach HaBavli, there's certainly a tam of chametz in the heter, why not activate the principle of tam ki ikar? And Tosfos says that Mishras is coming to teach me heter mitzaref leisur, like Rabbi Akiva, according to that sheet of the Rabbanan of Rabbi Eliezer, and therefore they don't have a source for tam ki ikar, because they hold that Gilei Nachrim is a chidush. They hold that Mishras is teaching me, in the case of Nazir, heter mitzaref leisur. They have no source now for tam ki ikar. They hold that tam ki ikar is the Rabban. And this leads us to the next Mishnah. Mirza Hashem will continue.